The cold disappearance of Emily and Connor Walsh, who dashed into thick air during camping. The summer heat rippled across the Sonoran Desert like water on glass, distorting the horizon where red rock formations met endless sky. In the small town of Oracle, Arizona, population 3,086, the local ranger station received a routine notification that would soon become anything but routine. A young couple from Indiana had registered for a 3-day camping permit in the remote Cañada del Oro wilderness area, 47 miles northeast of Tucson. Their names were Emily and Connor Walsh, both 28 years old, celebrating their second wedding anniversary with an adventure neither would survive. The Cañada del Oro, Spanish for Canyon of Gold, stretched across 11,000 acres of pristine desert landscape, a place where ancient saguaro cacti stood like sentinels and javelinas roamed freely through mesquite groves. It was beautiful, isolated, and unforgiving to those unprepared for its harsh realities. The Walshes, according to their permit application, planned to camp at Marker Site 14, a designated primitive camping area, accessible only by a 4-mile hike from the nearest parking area. They were expected to return by August 18, 2022. They never did. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters, manipulators, and trolls won't subscribe. If you believe people should be treated fairly, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you're not siding with the bully. Emily Rose Walsh, née Morrison, was born on April 12, 1994, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the middle child of Robert and Susan Morrison. She grew up in a modest colonial-style home on Maple Street, where neighborhood kids played kickball until the streetlights came on, and families gathered for block parties every 4th of July. Her childhood was unremarkably happy, filled with piano recitals, summer camps, and Sunday dinners at her grandmother's house. Emily's teachers at Northrop High School remembered her as conscientious and kind, the type of student who volunteered to tutor struggling classmates and organized fundraisers for the animal shelter. She wasn't the valedictorian or the prom queen, but she possessed something more valuable: genuine compassion that drew people to her naturally. Her yearbook photo from 2012 showed a young woman with long auburn hair, green eyes that seemed to smile even when her lips didn't, and an openness that suggested she believed the world was fundamentally good. After high school, Emily attended Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, majoring in elementary education. She worked part-time at a local bookstore, The Reading Corner, where she developed a reputation for recommending exactly the right book to customers, somehow intuiting what they needed even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. By the time she graduated in 2016 with her teaching degree, she had already been offered a position at Croninger Elementary School, where she would teach 2nd grade for the next 6 years. Connor James Walsh entered Emily's life in the autumn of 2018 at a friend's backyard bonfire. He was 24 then, working as a mechanical engineer at BF Goodrich Aerospace, designing components for aircraft landing systems. Connor had grown up in nearby Huntington, Indiana, the only child of Patricia Walsh, a single mother who had raised him after his father abandoned them when Connor was 3 years old. Connor's childhood had been harder than Emily's, marked by financial struggles and his mother's exhausting work schedule as a nurse. But Patricia had instilled in her son a fierce work ethic and unwavering integrity. Connor put himself through Purdue University, graduating with honors in mechanical engineering, and secured a job that finally brought his mother the financial stability she'd sacrificed everything to provide him. Friends who knew both Emily and Connor before they met described them as perfectly complementary. Emily was warm and extroverted, finding joy in social gatherings and community involvement. Connor was quieter, more analytical, content with small groups and deep conversations. She taught him to be more spontaneous. He taught her to be more deliberate. She loved hiking and outdoor adventures. He preferred museums and documentaries. Yet somehow, these differences created balance rather than friction. Their courtship was steady and unhurried. They dated for 18 months before Connor proposed on a spring evening in 2020 during a walk through the Fort Wayne Botanical Conservatory. The pandemic had just begun shutting down the world, but in that greenhouse, surrounded by orchids and tropical plants, Connor knelt and offered Emily a simple gold band with a small diamond, explaining that he'd been saving for months and promising something bigger when circumstances improved. Emily had cried and said yes before he'd finished his rehearsed speech. They married on June 5, 2020, in a small ceremony limited to 20 guests due to COVID-19 restrictions. The wedding took place in Emily's parents' backyard, with her father officiating after getting ordained online. Photographs from that day showed a couple utterly absorbed in each other, oblivious to the global crisis swirling around them. Emily wore a simple white sundress and carried wildflowers from a local farmer's market. Connor wore a navy suit he'd owned since college. The reception consisted of pizza from their favorite local restaurant and a playlist of songs they'd compiled together. The first 2 years of their marriage were, by all accounts, blissfully ordinary. They rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Fort Wayne's West Central neighborhood, adopted a rescue dog named Benny, and fell into comfortable rhythms of work. Weekend adventures and quiet evenings cooking dinner together. They were both frugal, saving aggressively for a down payment on a house, planning for a future that seemed safely within reach. Emily's colleagues at Croninger Elementary described her marriage with a mixture of admiration and gentle envy. She would arrive at school with a glow that had nothing to do with makeup, sharing little stories about Connor, surprising her with coffee in bed, or leaving funny notes in her lunch bag. Connor's co-workers at BF Goodrich noticed similar changes: his increased confidence, his willingness to contribute ideas in meetings, his general contentment with life. For their second anniversary, Emily proposed something different from their usual weekend getaways to Chicago or Indianapolis. She'd been reading about the American Southwest, fascinated by photographs of desert landscapes that seemed alien compared to Indiana's green flatlands and deciduous forests. She suggested they take a week-long trip to Arizona, spending time in both the desert and mountains, experiencing an ecosystem entirely unlike anything they'd known. Connor, though initially hesitant about the summer heat and unfamiliar terrain, agreed. They spent months planning, researching trails, purchasing proper hiking gear, and studying desert safety protocols. They understood they were Midwesterners venturing into an environment that demanded respect and preparation. They read about heat exhaustion, dehydration, flash floods, and wildlife encounters. They studied maps until they could recite trail names and distances from memory. In retrospect, friends and family would remember this planning phase with painful irony. Emily and Connor had done everything right, prepared for every contingency they could imagine, yet still walked into a situation no amount of preparation could have prevented, because the danger didn't come from the desert itself, but from something far more insidious. The couple departed Fort Wayne on August 12, 2022, driving Emily's 2018 Honda CR-V loaded with camping equipment, hiking gear, and enough supplies for a week in the wilderness. They planned to spend the first 2 nights in Tucson, acclimating to the altitude and heat, exploring Saguaro National Park during the day, before heading to their primitive camping site for 3 nights, then concluding their trip with 2 nights at a cabin near Sedona. Their social media posts from those first days in Arizona captured their excitement and wonder. Emily posted photographs of towering saguaros at sunset, their arms raised to a sky painted orange and purple. Connor shared a video of a roadrunner darting across their path during a morning hike, Emily's delighted laughter audible in the background. They documented meals at local restaurants, marveling at authentic Mexican food vastly superior to anything available in Indiana. On August 15th, they checked out of their Tucson hotel and drove to the Cañada del Oro trailhead parking area. According to the ranger station log, they arrived at 2:47 p.m., signed in, confirmed their permit details, and received a brief safety orientation from Ranger Carlos Mendoza, who would later testify about their demeanor and preparedness. They seemed experienced and well-equipped. Mendoza recalled during subsequent investigations. They had proper footwear, sun protection, adequate water containers, a detailed itinerary, and emergency communication devices. The woman, Emily, asked intelligent questions about wildlife and water sources. The husband, Connor, showed me their GPS unit and confirmed they'd downloaded offline maps. They were exactly the kind of visitors we hoped to see. People who respect the desert and prepare accordingly. Mendoza watched them set off up the trail at 3:15 p.m., their figures growing smaller as they navigated the rocky path into the wilderness. The temperature was 104 degrees Fahrenheit, typical for mid-August in southern Arizona. The forecast predicted clear skies and temperatures dropping to the low 70s overnight. Ideal camping weather by desert standards. That was the last confirmed sighting of Emily and Connor Walsh alive. When the couple failed to return by August 18th as scheduled, the ranger station initially wasn't concerned. Camping permits allowed flexibility, and visitors often extended stays or took extra days to explore. It wasn't until August 20th, when Connor's mother Patricia called the ranger station asking if anyone had heard from her son, that concern began to crystallize. Patricia Walsh explained that Connor had promised to call when they returned to cell service, which should have been no later than August 19th. She'd tried calling his phone repeatedly, receiving only voicemail. She'd messaged Emily on social media without response. She'd contacted their hotel in Sedona, which confirmed the Walshes had never checked in for their reservation. Patricia's voice, according to the ranger who took the call, carried the particular terror of a mother who knows something is fundamentally wrong. Ranger Mendoza drove to the trailhead parking area and found Emily's Honda CR-V still parked where they'd left it 5 days earlier. The vehicle was locked, covered in dust, and showed no signs of forced entry or damage. Inside, visible through the windows, were items the couple had clearly intended to use after their camping trip. Fresh clothes, toiletries, a cooler that had once contained food now spoiled in the heat. At 4:30 p.m. on August 20th, 2022, the Pima County Sheriff's Department initiated a missing persons investigation. Within hours, a search and rescue operation was mobilized. Coordinating efforts between the Sheriff's Department, U.S. Forest Service, and Arizona Department of Public Safety, the search for Emily and Connor Walsh began at dawn on August 21st. Over 60 volunteers joined professional search and rescue teams, including experienced trackers, helicopter pilots, and search dogs trained to locate human scent across vast desert terrain. The Cañada del Oro Wilderness, while not as extensive as some Arizona backcountry areas, presented unique challenges with its maze of canyons, seasonal washes, and dense vegetation that could conceal objects from aerial observation. Search Coordinator Lieutenant Maria Santos divided the wilderness into grid sections, prioritizing areas along the route from the trailhead to Marker Site 14, where the Walshes had planned to camp. The first significant discovery came within 3 hours. At Marker Site 14, searchers found the couple's campsite, and the scene was both reassuring and deeply disturbing. The tent was properly erected, staked securely against potential wind. Inside, sleeping bags lay neatly arranged, personal items organized in stuffed sacks, and camping gear stored methodically. A bear canister contained their remaining food supplies, properly sealed and hung from a designated pole. Everything suggested the couple had made camp, settled in, and maintained good wilderness practices. But there were anomalies that immediately troubled investigators. First, Connor's hiking boots sat just inside the tent entrance, but Emily's were missing. Second, Connor's day pack remained in the tent, but Emily's was gone. Third, and most troubling, was the evidence of a hasty departure. A camping stove sat assembled but cold, suggesting a meal had been started but never finished. A water bottle lay on its side near the fire ring, its contents long since evaporated or spilled. It appeared one person left the campsite in a hurry. Lieutenant Santos noted in her initial report. Possibly Emily Walsh, based on the missing boots and pack. But there's no clear indication of why or where she went, and no obvious explanation for Connor Walsh's whereabouts. The search expanded outward from Marker Site 14 in concentric circles. Dogs picked up human scent trails leading in multiple directions, But the trails fragmented and disappeared in the rocky terrain where scent doesn't cling. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras flew grid patterns over hundreds of acres, searching for heat signatures that might indicate human remains, living or deceased. On August 23rd, searchers found Emily's day pack wedged between boulders in a narrow canyon approximately 2 miles northeast of their campsite. The pack's contents provided more questions than answers. Inside were her wallet, phone, a half-empty water bottle, trail snacks, a first aid kit, and a small journal. The journal's final entry, dated August 16th, their first night camping, read, "The desert at night is unlike anything I've ever experienced. The stars are so bright it almost seems artificial. Connor built a perfect fire. We roasted marshmallows and talked about buying land somewhere like this someday. Building a little cabin, escaping Indiana winters. I feel so lucky, so perfectly content. Tomorrow we'll hike to Cathedral Rock and watch the sunrise. Life is good." The entry's tone made the subsequent disappearance even more inexplicable. There was no indication of distress, no premonition of danger. Just a happy woman enjoying an anniversary adventure with her husband. Emily's phone, though long dead from a drained battery, was taken as evidence. Later forensic analysis would reveal her last text message, sent at 6:47 p.m. on August 16th to Connor's mother, read, "Day 1 of camping was amazing. No service out here, but wanted you to know we're safe and having the best time. Love you." The message showed as failed to send due to lack of cell service remaining in her phone's outbox, a digital ghost of reassurance never received. As days passed without finding Emily or Connor, the investigation's focus shifted. Missing persons cases in wilderness areas typically result in one of several outcomes. The individuals are found alive, having become lost but surviving through resourcefulness. They're found deceased, victims of environmental hazards or medical emergencies. Or they're never found. The wilderness keeping its secrets forever. But certain aspects of the Walsh case didn't fit these familiar patterns. Both Emily and Connor had clearly made camp, settled in for the night. Then at some point, Emily had left the campsite with her pack and boots, while Connor had apparently remained behind, or left separately without his boots or pack. This suggested either a planned separation, unlikely given their careful preparations and emphasis on staying together, or an emergency that prompted Emily to leave quickly while Connor stayed behind for an unknown reason. The discovery of Emily's pack 2 miles from camp added another layer of confusion. If she'd left voluntarily for a hike, why abandon her pack? If she'd been fleeing something, what had she been fleeing from? And most pressing, where was Connor? On August 28th, 1 week into the search, the operation was officially scaled back from active rescue to recovery mode. The brutal reality of desert survival statistics made continued hope increasingly difficult to sustain. Without adequate water, a person could die of dehydration within 24 to 48 hours in Arizona's summer heat. Both Walshes had now been missing for 12 days. Emily's parents, Robert and Susan Morrison, arrived in Arizona on August 24th, renting a hotel room in Oracle that would become their base of operations for the next 3 years. They were joined by Connor's mother, Patricia, the three of them forming an unlikely family unit bound together by shared grief and desperate hope. The Morrisons and Patricia Walsh quickly became fixtures in Oracle, their faces familiar to every local resident. They organized volunteer search parties every weekend, distributing flyers with Emily and Connor's photographs throughout southern Arizona, and maintaining constant pressure on law enforcement to keep the case active. Local restaurants provided free meals, hotels offered discounted rates. Strangers donated money to fund private investigators and reward offers. But as summer turned to fall and fall to winter, the initial community sympathy began to cool into polite pity, then awkward avoidance. The family's presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of tragedy, of the wilderness's indifference to human hope, of the fundamental uncertainty that underlies existence. People wanted resolution, closure, the neat conclusion that would allow everyone to process the tragedy and move forward. The family's refusal to accept their children's likely deaths felt almost accusatory, as if their continued vigil judged others for returning to normal life. The investigation, meanwhile, had expanded beyond simple search and rescue into criminal investigation. While the working theory remained that Emily and Connor had encountered some wilderness emergency or accident, investigators couldn't ignore other possibilities. Lieutenant Santos requested assistance from the FBI's Violent Crimes Division, and by September 2022, the case had been assigned to Special Agent Derek Hammond, a veteran investigator specializing in missing persons cases with suspicious circumstances. Hammond approached the case with fresh eyes, unencumbered by the emotional investment of local searchers. He began by reconstructing the couple's movements and relationships, looking for any indication that their disappearance might not have been accidental. Financial records showed nothing suspicious. The Walshes lived modestly within their means, had no significant debts beyond student loans, maintained joint accounts with full transparency, and showed no pattern of unusual purchases or withdrawals. Their credit cards stopped being used after August 15th, consistent with being in a wilderness area without access to services. Social media analysis revealed a couple deeply in love, frequently posting affectionate messages about each other, sharing photographs of their life together, and maintaining large networks of friends who universally described their relationship as healthy and happy. There were no concerning posts, no hints of marital discord, no indication either person was involved in anything dangerous or secretive. Background checks came back clean. Neither Emily nor Connor had criminal records, not even traffic tickets. They paid taxes on time, maintained stable employment, and had no history of risky behavior or association with dangerous individuals. By every measure, they were responsible, law-abiding citizens who made careful decisions and avoided unnecessary risks. Yet they had vanished completely in a wilderness area that, while remote, was finite and had been thoroughly searched by experienced professionals. The lack of any trace became increasingly suspicious rather than simply tragic. Agent Hammond expanded his investigation to include everyone who had known the Walshes were traveling to Arizona. He interviewed their families, friends, co-workers, and neighbors back in Indiana. He examined their phone records, email accounts, and text message histories. He reviewed security camera footage from every gas station, hotel, and restaurant they'd visited during their trip. One name began appearing with increasing frequency in these investigations: Stephen Marcus, age 31, a childhood friend of Emily's from Fort Wayne. Stephen Marcus had grown up 3 houses down from the Morrison family on Maple Street. He and Emily had been inseparable as children, riding bikes together, building forts in her backyard, attending the same schools from kindergarten through high school. By all accounts, they'd been genuine friends, the kind of platonic relationship that crosses gender lines without romantic complication. But according to several of Emily's high school friends, Stephen's feelings for Emily had never been entirely platonic. Steve was in love with Emily from about 7th grade on, recalled Jennifer Patterson, Emily's best friend since middle school. Everyone could see it except Emily. She just thought of him as her buddy, her brother almost. Steve never told her how he felt, never made a move, just stayed close and hoped maybe she'd eventually see him differently. When Emily started dating Connor in 2018, Stephen's behavior had shifted noticeably. He became distant, declining invitations to group gatherings where the couple would be present, offering excuses for missing Emily's birthday parties and holiday celebrations. When Emily and Connor got engaged, Stephen sent a polite congratulations message, but didn't attend the wedding, claiming work obligations. After Emily got married, Steve basically disappeared from her life, Jennifer told investigators. They'd gone from talking almost daily to maybe exchanging messages on birthdays and holidays. I remember Emily being hurt by it, confused about why her old friend had pulled away. She had no idea he'd been carrying a torch for her all those years. Stephen Marcus worked as a software developer for a tech company based in Indianapolis, a job that allowed him to work remotely from his apartment in Fort Wayne. Colleagues described him as competent but socially awkward, someone who kept to himself and rarely participated in office culture, even during the occasional mandatory in-person meetings. When Agent Hammond interviewed Stephen on October 3, 2022, the young man seemed cooperative but nervous. He confirmed his longtime friendship with Emily, acknowledged he distanced himself after her marriage, and expressed shock and sadness about her disappearance. "Emily was one of the best people I've ever known," Stephen said, his voice catching slightly. "She deserved every happiness. I hope you find her and Connor safe." When asked about his whereabouts in mid-August, Stephen provided an alibi that initially seemed solid. He'd been working from home in Fort Wayne, attending virtual meetings documented in his work calendar, making credit card purchases at local establishments, and maintaining his usual routine. Phone records showed his cell phone consistently pinging towers in the Fort Wayne area throughout the relevant time period. But Agent Hammond had learned to distrust easy alibis. He dug deeper, requesting detailed analysis of Stephen's work computer, credit card transactions, and phone records. What he discovered was both subtle and damning. Stephen's work computer showed normal activity on August 15th and 16th, but closer examination revealed something odd. The IP address associated with his remote work login had changed. On those specific dates, rather than connecting from his home internet service, the login came from a VPN that routed through multiple servers, ultimately originating from a public Wi-Fi network at a truck stop in Deming, New Mexico, approximately 200 miles from where Emily and Connor were camping. Credit card analysis revealed more irregularities. On August 12th, the same day the Walshes departed Indiana, Stephen had rented a Toyota Camry from an Enterprise location near the Fort Wayne airport. The rental agreement showed a planned return date of August 20th. But there was no record of Stephen purchasing airline tickets, no indication he'd planned to travel. Nothing that explained why a man who owned a perfectly functional vehicle would need a rental car for 8 days. Stephen's personal credit card showed purchases at gas stations along Interstate 70 heading west from Indiana on August 12th and 13th, then Interstate 40 through Oklahoma, the Texas Panhandle, and New Mexico. The trail of receipts stopped in Deming, New Mexico on August 14th, then resumed traveling eastward on August 18th, eventually terminating with the car's return to Fort Wayne on August 20th. Stephen Marcus had driven approximately 3,600 miles round trip during the exact window when Emily and Connor Walsh disappeared. Armed with this evidence, Agent Hammond obtained a warrant to search Stephen's apartment and electronics more thoroughly. On October 15th, 2022, FBI agents executed the warrant, seizing Stephen's computers, phones, and personal documents. The search revealed years of obsessive documentation. On Stephen's laptop, investigators found folders containing thousands of photographs of Emily, many downloaded from social media, but others that appeared to have been taken surreptitiously, pictures of her at restaurants, walking to her car, entering her school. There were documents containing detailed information about her daily routine, her favorite places, her habits and patterns. Most disturbing was a folder labeled Trip Planning, containing printouts of Emily and Connor's Arizona itinerary. Stephen had somehow accessed their trip details, their camping permits, their hotel reservations, everything. Further investigation revealed he'd been monitoring Emily's email account, having obtained her password years earlier when he'd helped her recover from a supposed hacking incident in college. He'd been reading her private correspondence for years without her knowledge. In Stephen's bedroom closet, agents found camping equipment purchased in early August 2022. A tent, sleeping bag, hiking boots, and desert camouflage clothing, all still bearing price tags. They found maps of the Cañada del Oro wilderness with marker site 14 circled in red marker. They found a hunting knife with a 7-inch blade, cleaned but showing traces of what subsequent testing would identify as human blood. Stephen Marcus was arrested on October 16, 2022, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He immediately requested an attorney and refused to make any statements. The evidence against him was substantial but circumstantial. Prosecutors could prove he'd lied about his whereabouts, that he'd been obsessed with Emily, that he'd traveled to Arizona during the relevant time frame, and that he'd possessed equipment and knowledge consistent with encountering the Walshes at their remote campsite. What they couldn't prove without remains was that Emily and Connor Walsh were actually dead. The case against Stephen Marcus stalled. His attorney, a skilled criminal defense lawyer named Patricia Donovan, filed motions arguing that no crime could be proven without bodies, that the evidence showed obsessive behavior, but not murder, and that the prosecution's theory was speculative at best. Without physical evidence definitively linking Stephen to the couple's disappearance, getting a conviction would be challenging. The months dragged on through fall 2022, into winter, then into spring 2023. Stephen remained in custody, held without bail as a flight risk. The investigation continued, but without bodies or witnesses. The case seemed destined to become another unsolved mystery. Another example of the American Southwest's vast spaces swallowing people without trace. Emily's parents and Connor's mother refused to give up. They returned to Arizona every few months, organizing search parties, hiking trails, studying maps, refusing to accept that their children were simply gone. They hired private investigators, consulted with psychics despite their skepticism, followed every possible lead, no matter how implausible. And then, 3 years almost to the day after the disappearance, everything changed. On August 12th, in 2025, a group of experienced hikers from California were exploring an unmarked canyon system approximately 5 miles southeast of marker site 14, well outside the original search grid. The group consisted of 4 friends who specialized in discovering and documenting unexplored areas, sometimes venturing into terrain most hikers avoided. At approximately 2:30 p.m., as the group navigated a particularly narrow section of canyon, one hiker, Daniel Kovacs, noticed something unusual wedged into a crevice about 15 feet above the canyon floor. It appeared to be fabric, faded and weathered, but distinctly artificial in an environment of rock and desert plants. Using climbing gear, Kovacs ascended to investigate. What he found would finally provide answers the Morrison and Walsh families had desperately sought for 3 years. Hidden in a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall were human remains, 2 bodies placed side by side, partially mummified by the dry desert air. They were clothed in hiking attire, and based on the state of decomposition and environmental preservation, had clearly been there for several years. Nearby lay 2 backpacks, their contents remarkably preserved. Wallets containing identification cards with the names Emily Rose Walsh and Connor James Walsh. The hikers immediately contacted authorities. By 4 p.m., Pima County Sheriff's deputies had reached the remote location by helicopter. By evening, a full forensic recovery team was working to carefully extract and preserve the remains and evidence. The location's remoteness explained why previous searches had missed the bodies. The canyon where they were found wasn't visible from aerial observation, required technical climbing skills to access, and sat well outside the logical search radius based on where Emily and Connor had been camping. Someone had deliberately transported them there, placing them in a location unlikely to be discovered accidentally. The remains were transported to the Pima County Medical Examiner's office for analysis. Dr. Richard Foster, the chief medical examiner, conducted thorough examinations over several days. His findings were definitive. Emily Walsh had died from a single deep knife wound to her chest that had penetrated her heart, causing rapid death. The angle and depth of the wound suggested an attack from someone facing her, someone she'd likely been speaking with when the knife struck. Connor Walsh's cause of death was more complex. He'd sustained multiple defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, indicating he'd fought his attacker. The fatal injury was blunt force trauma to the back of his skull, consistent with being struck from behind with a heavy object, possibly a rock, while already weakened from defensive struggle. Based on decomposition patterns, insect activity, and environmental factors, Dr. Foster estimated both individuals had died within hours of each other on or around August 16, 2022, their first night camping. They'd been moved to the canyon location shortly after death, before rigor mortis would have made transport difficult. The discovery of the bodies transformed the case against Stephen Marcus from circumstantial to concrete. But prosecutors knew they needed more than location. They needed forensic evidence definitively linking Stephen to the murders. That evidence came from the knife found in Stephen's apartment. While he'd cleaned it thoroughly, modern forensic techniques can detect microscopic traces of biological material even after extensive cleaning. Advanced DNA testing on samples collected from the knife's handle and blade base revealed matches to both Emily and Connor Walsh. Additionally, forensic analysis of Stephen's rental car, which had been preserved as evidence, revealed traces of Arizona desert soil in the trunk and floor mats. The soil's mineral composition exactly matched samples taken from the canyon where the bodies were found, a geological signature as unique as a fingerprint. With this new evidence, prosecutors were ready to proceed. But they faced an unexpected development. On September 3, 2025, Stephen Marcus's attorney contacted the district attorney's office with an extraordinary proposal. Stephen wanted to confess, to explain what had happened, and to plead guilty in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole, rather than face a trial that might result in the death penalty. The confession was scheduled for September 10, 2025. Stephen Marcus sat across from prosecutors, his attorney, FBI agent Hammond, and Lieutenant Santos in an interview room at the Pima County Courthouse. What he revealed over the next 2 hours provided the final, terrible pieces of the puzzle. "I loved Emily from the time I understood what love meant," Stephen began, his voice flat and effectless. "We were kids together, best friends, and somewhere along the way, my feelings changed, but hers never did. I waited for years, thinking maybe if I was patient enough, she'd eventually see me the way I saw her." He described watching Emily fall in love with Connor. The pain of attending their wedding rehearsal dinner, even though he'd claimed work prevented him from attending the actual ceremony. The growing obsession that consumed his thoughts. "When I found out they were going camping in Arizona, something broke in me," he continued. "I told myself I was going to talk to Emily, to finally tell her how I felt, to give her the chance to choose me. I knew it was crazy, knew she was married and happy, but I couldn't let go of this fantasy that maybe, if she just understood the depth of my feelings, everything would change. Stephen described his meticulous planning, hacking Emily's email to learn their itinerary, renting a car to avoid his vehicle being tracked, purchasing camping equipment and weapons, and driving across the country. He'd arrived at Cañada del Oro on August 15th, a day before the Walshes, and had hiked to marker site 14, confirming it was where they'd be camping. I set up my own camp about a mile away and waited, he said. I watched them arrive, watched them make their camp, so happy together. I kept telling myself I'd just talk to Emily, explain my feelings, and she'd understand. The knife was just for protection, for wildlife, not for them. On the evening of August 16th, Stephen had approached their campsite after dark. Connor was collecting firewood while Emily was preparing dinner. Stephen called out to avoid startling her, and Emily, recognizing his voice despite the unexpectedness of his presence, had emerged from the tent confused but not yet frightened. She asked what I was doing there, how I'd known where to find them. Stephen recalled, his voice beginning to crack. I started trying to explain, telling her I'd always loved her, that I'd traveled all this way because I needed her to know. She was kind about it, the way Emily always was kind. But she told me she loved Connor, that nothing was going to change, that I needed to let go and move on. Connor had returned while they were talking, immediately sensing something wrong. According to Stephen, Connor had been protective but not aggressive, positioning himself between Emily and Stephen while telling Stephen he needed to leave and suggesting they could talk more rationally in the morning. Something in me snapped, Stephen said, tears now streaming down his face. 3 years of pain, of loneliness, of watching her love someone else. It all came to a head in that moment. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted the hurt to stop. Stephen had pulled the knife, initially just holding it, using it to emphasize his words. But Connor had moved toward him, attempting to disarm him and protect Emily. They'd struggled, and in the chaos, Stephen had pushed past Connor and struck Emily with the knife, the blade penetrating her chest before he'd even consciously decided to attack. She looked at me with such shock, Stephen whispered. Not anger, not hatred, just complete incomprehension. She fell, and Connor screamed and came at me. We fought, and I kept thinking I just needed to get away, to run. But Connor was stronger than me and wouldn't let me go. I grabbed a rock and hit him. I just kept hitting him until he stopped moving. In the immediate aftermath, Stephen had panicked. He'd committed a double murder in a remote location, but had left extensive evidence of his obsession in his apartment back in Indiana. He'd quickly formulated a plan: move the bodies far from the campsite, making them difficult to find, return to his hidden camp, pack up and hike out before dawn, and establish an alibi that would suggest he'd never left Indiana. I thought I could make it look like they'd just disappeared, he said. People vanish in the desert all the time. I thought if they were never found, maybe there'd be no investigation, or it would focus on accidents rather than murder. He'd carried Emily's body first, taking nearly 2 hours to transport her to the canyon where she'd eventually be found. He'd returned for Connor, the physical exertion nearly breaking him. He'd placed them side by side because, he claimed, it seemed like Emily would want to be with her husband, even in death. Then he'd returned to their campsite, attempting to stage it to look like they'd left for a hike. He'd taken Emily's day pack, intending to dispose of it far from their camp to create confusion about their movements, but had ultimately abandoned it when exhaustion overwhelmed him. I convinced myself it was a tragic accident, that I'd been defending myself, that I hadn't meant for any of it to happen. Stephen said, his voice barely audible now. But I knew. I've known every day for 3 years that I murdered 2 innocent people because I couldn't accept that Emily didn't love me the way I loved her. When asked why he was confessing now, Stephen seemed to struggle for words. Because living with it has been its own prison, he finally said. Every day, knowing what I'd done, pretending to be normal, watching their families suffer, it destroyed whatever was left of my soul. I kept telling myself at the time that this was somehow right, that if I couldn't have Emily, at least Connor couldn't either. But I understand now how insane that was, how evil. I took 2 beautiful people out of the world because of my own selfishness and delusion. He paused, wiping his eyes with handcuffed hands. I thought at the time it was the best solution. I actually believed that. But now I understand I was wrong about everything. I was wrong about love, wrong about Emily, wrong about what it means to care about someone. Real love wants the other person to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't include you. What I felt wasn't love at all. It was possession, obsession, and ultimately, it was evil. The confession, recorded and transcribed, ran to 87 pages. It provided details only the killer could have known. The exact location where he'd hidden his camping gear before fleeing Arizona, still buried under rocks in a canyon 3 miles from where the bodies were found. The specific route he'd taken to transport the bodies. Even the moments of his struggle with Connor, details that matched the defensive wounds found on the remains. On September 24, 2020, Stephen Marcus appeared before Judge Thomas Richardson in Pima County Superior Court for formal sentencing. The courtroom was packed with media, curious onlookers, and most importantly, the families who had waited 3 years for this moment. Robert and Susan Morrison sat in the front row, holding hands. Their faces aged far beyond the 3 years that had passed. Patricia Walsh sat beside them. Connor's mother, now bound to the Morrisons through shared tragedy in ways that transcended their children's marriage. Judge Richardson allowed victim impact statements before pronouncing sentence. Susan Morrison approached the podium first, her prepared statement trembling in her hands. Emily was our miracle baby, she began, her voice stronger than anyone expected. We'd tried for years to have children, suffered multiple miscarriages, and had nearly given up hope when she came into our lives. From the moment she was born, she brought light into every space she occupied. She was kind, thoughtful, generous, and full of dreams about the future. Susan looked directly at Stephen for the first time. You took all of that away because of your own twisted fantasy. You didn't love Emily. If you had loved her, you would have wanted her happiness above your own desires. Instead, you murdered her because she dared to love someone else, to build a life that didn't include you. You didn't just kill our daughter. You killed her dreams, her future students who would have learned from her, the children she and Connor talked about having someday, the decades of love and life she deserved to experience. She paused, her composure cracking slightly. For 3 years, we didn't know if she'd suffered, if she'd been afraid, if she'd died quickly or slowly. That not knowing was its own torture. Now we know she died because of you. Because you couldn't accept rejection like a mature adult. I hope you understand that every day you spend in prison is a gift you don't deserve. Emily and Connor don't get any more days. They don't get to grow old, to achieve their dreams, to experience anything beyond that canyon, where you left them like garbage. Robert Morrison spoke next, his statement shorter but no less powerful. Connor became the son I never had, he said simply. He loved our daughter completely, treated her with respect and tenderness, and made her happier than we'd ever seen her. You took him from his mother, from us, and from a world that needed more people like him and fewer people like you. Patricia Walsh's statement was the most difficult to hear. As a single mother who had sacrificed everything to raise her son, her grief carried layers of lost dreams and stolen futures. Connor was my whole world, she said, tears streaming unchecked down her face. I worked double shifts for years so he could go to college, could have opportunities I never had. I was so proud of the man he became, the engineer who solved complex problems, the husband who adored his wife, the son who called his mother every Sunday without fail. He was going to give me grandchildren someday. We had plans for holidays, for trips, for growing old together. She turned to face Stephen directly. You didn't just kill my son. You killed every future moment we should have shared. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone. You stole 30, 40, maybe 50 years that Connor should have lived. And for what? Because you couldn't handle that a woman didn't return your feelings? Do you understand how pathetic that is? How absolutely contemptible? Her voice rose with anger now. 3 years of suppressed rage finally finding expression. My son fought you. The medical examiner said his defensive wounds showed he fought hard to protect Emily and himself. He died trying to defend the woman he loved from a coward who attacked them in the darkness. Connor was brave until his last breath. And you are nothing but a pathetic, selfish murderer who destroyed beautiful lives because of your own inadequacy. The courtroom was silent, except for quiet sobbing from various spectators. Even seasoned court reporters appeared moved by the raw emotion of the statements. Judge Richardson finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. Mr. Marcus, you have pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution has agreed not to seek the death penalty in exchange for your confession and cooperation. However, let me be absolutely clear. The only reason you are not facing execution is prosecutorial discretion, not because your crimes merit any mercy. The judge reviewed the facts of the case, the premeditation involved in Stephen's actions, the betrayal of a friendship that had lasted since childhood, and the calculated attempt to conceal his crimes. You have shown some capacity for remorse in your confession, Judge Richardson continued. But I note that this remorse emerged only after you were conclusively caught, after forensic evidence made denial impossible. For 3 years, you allowed the families of your victims to suffer without answers, to hold on to hope that perhaps their loved ones might still be found alive. That is a cruelty that extends beyond the murders themselves. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Stephen. The law provides for certain punishments for certain crimes. In this case, the sentence is clear. For the murder of Emily Rose Walsh, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the murder of Connor James Walsh, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively. You will spend every remaining day of your life in custody, and you will die in prison. That is the consequence of your actions. Stephen Marcus showed no visible reaction to the sentencing. He simply nodded slightly, as if confirming something he'd already known and accepted. As bailiffs prepared to escort him from the courtroom, Susan Morrison called out, her voice cutting through the procedural murmurs. Stephen. He turned to face her, and for a moment, their eyes met across the courtroom. I want you to know something, Susan said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. I will never forgive you. I will never understand what made you think you had the right to decide whether my daughter lived or died. But I want you to spend every day in prison remembering that Emily was good and kind, even to you, even when you were obsessing over her. She deserves so much better than what you gave her. Remember that. Remember what you destroyed. Stephen was led away without responding, disappearing through the door that would carry him to prison and out of the free world forever. The investigation's conclusion brought a measure of closure to Oracle and to the broader community that had followed the case. The mystery of the missing couple had finally been solved, the responsible party identified and punished. But for those closest to Emily and Connor Walsh, the resolution felt incomplete. Robert and Susan Morrison returned to Fort Wayne, to the house on Maple Street where Emily had grown up. They established a memorial scholarship in her name at Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne, providing financial support for education majors who demonstrated Emily's combination of academic achievement and genuine compassion for children. Every year, they attend the scholarship ceremony, meeting young teachers who carry forward Emily's dream of helping children find their voices. Patricia Walsh remained in Fort Wayne as well, though she sold the house where she'd raised Connor and moved into a smaller apartment. She became involved with a support group for families of murder victims, finding purpose in helping others navigate the impossible grief she understood too intimately. She keeps a photograph of Connor on her mantle, forever 28 years old, forever smiling, forever the son who made every sacrifice worthwhile. The three of them, Robert, Susan, and Patricia, remain close, getting together for monthly dinners and marking significant dates together. Emily and Connor's birthdays, their wedding anniversary, the anniversary of their deaths. They've become family in ways that transcend the marriage that originally connected them, bound together by shared loss and the determination to honor two lives that ended far too soon. In Arizona, the canyon where Emily and Connor's bodies were found has become an unofficial memorial site. Hikers who learn the story sometimes leave flowers or small tokens at the location, though the families have requested that the exact coordinates remain undisclosed to prevent the site from becoming a morbid tourist attraction. The Cañada del Oro wilderness continues to draw campers and hikers, its beauty unmarred by the tragedy that occurred there. The desert keeping its secrets while slowly, patiently reclaiming all human traces. Agent Derek Hammond, who led the investigation from the FBI side, retired in 2024, but came out of retirement specifically to see the Marcus case through to its conclusion. He attended the sentencing, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, and afterward spoke briefly with the families. "Cases like this remind me why I spent 30 years doing this work," he told them. "Not every victim gets justice. Not every family gets answers. But when we can provide both, when we can ensure that someone who committed evil faces consequences, it matters." Emily and Connor mattered. What happened to them mattered. And I'm grateful we could give you at least this much. Lieutenant Maria Santos, who coordinated the original search effort and never stopped believing the case could be solved, also attended the sentencing. In an interview afterwards, she reflected on the investigation's long arc. "We searched for 3 years, following leads that went nowhere, pursuing theories that collapsed under scrutiny," she said. "There were times when I wondered if we'd ever know what happened to the Walshes. But we never closed the case, never stopped investigating. And ultimately, that persistence paid off. The discovery of their remains was tragic, but it gave the families something they desperately needed. Truth." She paused, considering her words carefully. "People sometimes ask me how I deal with cases like this, with the violence and grief and senselessness. The answer is that I focus on what we can control. We can't bring victims back. We can't undo tragedy. But we can seek truth. We can pursue justice, and we can give families the dignity of answers. That's what we did for Emily and Connor Walsh. The case has become a teaching example in criminal justice programs, illustrating the importance of persistent investigation, the value of forensic evidence, and the ways that digital footprints can reveal deception, even in carefully constructed alibis. Stephen Marcus's attempt to establish a false alibi while traveling to Arizona is now studied as a cautionary tale about the impossibility of truly disappearing in a digitally connected world. It's also become a somber lesson about obsession and the danger of confusing obsession with love. Mental health professionals have analyzed Stephen's behavior, noting the warning signs that preceded his violent actions, the years of unreciprocated feelings, the inability to move forward. The monitoring of Emily's life through social media and hacked email accounts, the growing sense that he was entitled to her affection simply because he desired it. What Stephen Marcus displayed wasn't love in any meaningful sense, explained Dr. Rachel Foster, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case. It was a parasocial fixation that he'd constructed in his own mind, an elaborate fantasy where Emily existed not as a real person with her own agency and desires, but as an object meant to fulfill his emotional needs. When reality contradicted that fantasy, when Emily asserted her own choices and her love for Connor, Stephen couldn't accept it. The violence that followed was his attempt to destroy a reality he couldn't control. For students at Croninger Elementary School in Fort Wayne, where Emily taught second grade, her memory lives on in ways both formal and informal. A memorial garden was planted in the school's courtyard, featuring Emily's favorite flowers and a stone bench where children can sit and read. Her former students, now in their early teens, still remember Mrs. Walsh with affection, recalling her patience, her creativity in making lessons engaging, and her genuine interest in each child's individual personality and needs. She made everyone feel special, said Marcus Chen, who was in Emily's class during her final year of teaching. Even the kids who struggled or who got in trouble, she never gave up on them. She'd stay after school to help with reading or math, and she'd remember things you told her, like your favorite book or what you did over the weekend. She actually cared. The bookstore where Emily worked during college, the Reading Corner, maintains a small memorial display featuring Emily's photograph and a collection of her favorite books. The owners, an elderly couple who had employed Emily for 4 years, remember her with particular fondness. Emily had an almost supernatural ability to recommend exactly the right book to customers, recalled Margaret Chen, the bookstore's owner. She'd talk to someone for 5 minutes and then pull a book off the shelf that they didn't even know they needed. She brought so much energy and enthusiasm to this place. We think about her every day. In the broader community of Fort Wayne, Emily and Connor's story has become a reminder of how quickly life can change, how precious and fragile ordinary happiness truly is. Their wedding photo, the image of 2 people utterly absorbed in each other on a summer day in a backyard, has been reproduced in local media coverage so often that it's become iconic, a symbol of love interrupted and futures stolen. Connor's former colleagues at B.F. Goodrich Aerospace established an annual engineering scholarship in his name at Purdue University, ensuring that his legacy includes supporting future engineers who will carry forward the work he was passionate about. The scholarship specifically targets students from single-parent households, honoring Patricia Walsh's sacrifice in raising Connor and Connor's own appreciation for the opportunities his mother had made possible. Stephen Marcus began serving his sentence at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, a maximum security facility housing some of Arizona's most dangerous criminals. According to prison records, he keeps largely to himself, participates in no group activities, and receives no visitors aside from his attorney handling appeals that everyone, including Stephen, seems to understand are futile. Guards and prison mental health professionals who interact with Stephen report that he appears genuinely remorseful, often withdrawn and visibly depressed. But there's debate about whether this remorse stems from true moral recognition of his crimes, or simply from regret about getting caught and losing his freedom. The distinction matters little to his victims' families, who have no interest in his emotional state or rehabilitation. "I don't care if Stephen Marcus spends every day of his life in anguish over what he did," Robert Morrison told a reporter on the first anniversary of the sentencing. "No amount of his suffering will bring Emily back or undo the trauma he inflicted on our family. The only thing that matters is that he can never hurt anyone else, that he'll die in prison having lost everything he valued, just as he took everything we valued." The rental car company that Stephen used, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, implemented new policies following the case, requiring additional documentation and verification for customers renting vehicles for extended periods, particularly when those rentals don't align with logical travel patterns. While these measures likely won't prevent determined criminals from renting vehicles for nefarious purposes, they represent an attempt to add friction to the planning process. Email service providers and social media companies also examined their security protocols following revelations about how Stephen had accessed Emily's accounts. While the companies declined to comment specifically on the Walsh case, several implemented enhanced security measures, including mandatory two-factor authentication and alerts when accounts are accessed from unusual locations. The Pima County Sheriff's Department revised its missing person search protocols based on lessons learned from the Walsh case. Now, when hikers or campers fail to return as scheduled, the initial search grid extends further from expected locations, and forensic teams are brought in earlier to analyze any campsites or personal belongings discovered. These changes have already proven valuable in several subsequent cases, enabling faster recovery of missing individuals, both alive and deceased. The canyon where Emily and Connor's bodies were found has been carefully documented and mapped, but remains unmarked and unnamed in official records. The families requested that no formal memorial be placed at the location, preferring that it remain simply part of the wilderness rather than forever defined by tragedy. Occasionally, hikers who know the story make the difficult trek to the site, leaving small remembrances, flowers, notes, or simple stones stacked in cairns. The desert wind eventually scatters these offerings, returning the canyon to its natural state, a place of ancient stone and sky that existed long before human tragedy, and will remain long after human memory fades. 3 years have now passed since Stephen Marcus was sentenced. 6 years since Emily and Connor Walsh died in the Arizona desert. The case is officially closed, the investigation complete, the perpetrator incarcerated. But for those who loved Emily and Connor, the case will never truly be closed because the loss continues, compounding with every milestone that should have been celebrated, every moment that should have been shared. Emily would have turned 31 in 2025, would likely have had children by now, would still be teaching and shaping young lives. Connor would have continued advancing in his engineering career, would have been caring for his aging mother, would have been planning for a future that stretched decades ahead. Instead, they remain forever 28, frozen in photographs and memories, their potential unfulfilled, their dreams unrealized. The question that haunts everyone who knew them is the simplest and most unanswerable. Why? Why did Stephen Marcus believe he had the right to decide that if Emily wouldn't love him, she wouldn't love anyone? Why did he think his desires outweighed her autonomy? Why did he choose violence over acceptance, murder over moving forward with his own life? These questions have no satisfying answers, because the reasoning of someone capable of such acts exists outside the boundaries of empathy and rationality that govern most human behavior. Stephen Marcus made a choice, a choice that destroyed multiple lives and rippled outward through families and communities, leaving scars that will never fully heal. In the end, the story of Emily and Connor Walsh is a tragedy in the truest sense. Good people destroyed by circumstances they couldn't have anticipated or prevented, victims of someone else's delusion and violence. They went camping to celebrate their love, to experience the beauty of a landscape foreign to their Midwest sensibilities, to create memories that would sustain them through years of ordinary life ahead. Instead, they became another statistic, another cautionary tale, another reminder that evil can wear familiar faces and hide behind claimed affection. Their story joins countless others in the long catalog of lives cut short by violence, of families shattered by loss, of justice that comes too late to matter to those it should have protected. But their story is also one of love that endured beyond death, of families who refused to give up, of investigators who pursued truth even when it seemed impossible to find, and of a community that, despite its initial failures to protect them, ultimately ensured their killer-faced consequences. It's a story about the value of persistence, the importance of truth, and the recognition that every victim deserves justice, regardless of how long it takes to achieve. Emily and Connor Walsh rest now in Fort Wayne, Indiana, far from the Arizona desert where they died, buried in the Midwest soil that nurtured them and shaped them. Their grave marker is simple: their names, their dates, and a single line that Robert and Susan Morrison chose with Patricia Walsh's agreement. Together in love, together in eternity. On weekends, you might find family members visiting, tending the flowers planted around the headstone, sitting quietly in remembrance. Occasionally, former students of Emily's come by, now teenagers who remember their second-grade teacher and want to honor her memory. Sometimes Connor's former colleagues stop by, engineers who worked alongside him and valued his contributions and friendship. The visits grow less frequent as years pass, as life demands attention and acute grief gradually transforms into lasting sadness, a permanent undercurrent rather than an overwhelming wave. But the Morrisons and Patricia Walsh continue their monthly dinners, continue marking significant dates, continue ensuring that Emily and Connor are remembered not just as victims, but as beloved individuals whose lives had meaning beyond their tragic ends. In his prison cell in Florence, Arizona, Stephen Marcus lives with the consequences of his actions, serving a sentence that will end only with his death. Whether he spends his days in genuine remorse or merely in regret for his incarceration is unknowable and ultimately irrelevant. What matters is that he can cause no further harm, that justice, however imperfect and delayed, was ultimately served. The Sonoran Desert continues its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human tragedy. Saguaros bloom in spring, monsoons flood arroyos in summer, temperatures moderate in winter. Campers and hikers still explore the Cañada del Oro wilderness, most unaware of the tragedy that occurred there, simply enjoying the stark beauty of a landscape that has witnessed countless human stories across millennia. And somewhere in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in a modest house on Maple Street, photographs of a smiling young woman with auburn hair and green eyes still line the walls. A wedding album sits on a living room shelf, documenting a perfect June day when everything seemed possible, when the future stretched ahead unlimited and bright, when two people who loved each other deeply promised forever. They got only 2 years instead of forever. But in those 2 years, they built something beautiful, a marriage founded on genuine affection, mutual respect, and shared dreams. They were happy. They were loved. And though their time together was horrifically abbreviated, that happiness and that love remained true, untarnished by the evil that ended their lives. That's what Susan Morrison tells herself on difficult days, when grief threatens to overwhelm her, when anger at the injustice of it all makes it hard to breathe. Emily and Connor had 2 wonderful years together. They died knowing they were loved, died together, died in a place they'd chosen to visit because they wanted to experience beauty and adventure. Yes, they deserved decades more. Yes, what happened to them was monstrously unfair. But for 2 years, they had exactly what everyone hopes to find: a partner who saw them fully and loved them completely. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's true, and sometimes truth is all we have to hold on to when everything else has been taken away. The case of Emily Rose Walsh and Connor James Walsh, missing persons turned murder victims, officially closed on September 24, 2025, serves as a permanent reminder that justice matters, that truth matters, and that every life has value worth fighting for. Even when that fight takes years and the victory tastes of ashes rather than triumph. Their story is over, but their memory endures, carried forward by those who loved them, by investigators who solved their case, by students who learned from Emily, by colleagues who worked with Connor, and by anyone who hears their story and understands that behind every statistic, every headline, every cold case file, there are real people whose lives mattered, whose deaths deserve justice, and whose memory deserves to be preserved with dignity and respect. Emily and Connor Walsh went camping in August 2022 to celebrate their 2nd anniversary. They never came home. But they are not forgotten. They never will be. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters, manipulators, and trolls won't subscribe. If you believe people should be treated fairly, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you're not siding with the bully.